Now, this is Ryan Kester. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of his background, but he is a teenage true crime genius, and he's on his way to becoming an attorney. The uh, the supporters latched on to him when he was 14 years old, right? Cathy Ramsey, more than any of the others. And they made him the administrator of Cathy's group that she still has today at 14 years old, right? And I used to argue with him back and forth. He was kind of nasty, but not really. He was, he wasn't trying to be as bad as they were. And I'm like, what are you doing here? I said, these people are using you. And blah, blah, blah. I know she's innocent. Blah, 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 blah. I can prove it. I know she's innocent. I said, you're going to find out how these people really are. And they kept using him. They blocked me. That's why she blocked me from her group years ago because of Ryan Kester. Right? So I felt like they were taking advantage of this guy. Right? So I called his mother. And I said, look, these Darlie Routier supporters, they're evil people. They're nasty. They will use him. They've promoted him to an administrator in one of these groups where they're telling lies left and right and blah, blah, blah. So she took a look at it. And they jumped all over me for calling his mom. Well, now he doesn't believe that Darlie's innocent. As a matter of fact, if you listen to Roberta Glass, let me put it over here real quick. If you listen to Roberta Glass, her true crime report, you can hear him on Darlie Routier is dangerous. Uh, he does a lot of stuff in true crime today. He's still out there. He just doesn't talk about the Darlie case. But you can hear him at Darlie Routier is dangerous. Roberta Glass true crime report. All right. So after I called his mother, I believe she pulled him out of that group because he didn't go on anymore. But as he studied the case, he wanted to go down and get some of the evidence. They wouldn't let him have a lot of the physical evidence because they felt like it would be damaged. He got some of it. He got some of the photos that weren't shown and stuff like that. And after the photos that weren't shown, let me clarify, were not photos of her bruises. And after he did his own independent investigation, now he feels like Darlie's guilty. So he leaves the support, right? He wants nothing to do with it. And he gets harassed by people like Damon Fragapane, whatever the fuck his name is, Fragapney, even Darlie Key herself, because she harassed me. Damien picked on him for being gay. So I wanted to go on to this thing here where Ryan's actually speaking, where he's getting to the part where he leaves support.
Donald,
Oh, I know.
the pajama top.
I know. That was something that I was very, very interested in talking about how they were able to determine that he wouldn't have been thrashing around because they were basically perfect cylinder holes.
As I'm talking to you or listening to you talk or talking with you, I am kicking myself for not interviewing you at the time you were a Darlie supporter because I'm listening to you thinking, I'm pretty firmly Darlie did at camp, but wow, are you persuasive? Did you persuade people? Were you an advocate for her?
Yes, I probably could have. And it's kind of a double-edged sword because now people are looking at me and they're saying, oh, well, he was able to persuade me she was not guilty, so why should I listen to him that she was guilty? And, I haven't changed my opinion on any of the evidence. I can still logically come up with an excuse for every piece of evidence that's in that house. The issue is there was some evidence that was brought to light, such as the fingerprint that I didn't know about in the past. The issue is that you can't make excuses for every piece of evidence where every piece of evidence has to be excused through some alternative scenario.
He was talking about the fingerprint, and I agreed with him. That fingerprint, 85J, it comes back to a female in the DNA. The STR DNA, it comes back to a female ring finger. Now, the supporters, they'll tell you, oh, that was a man's print, and blah, blah, blah. No. That comes back to a female, according to DNA. So let them test. All they want.
Uses for every piece of evidence where every piece of evidence has to be excused through some alternative scenario. You have to come up with a cohesive one. And I simply cannot do that. You can't look at every piece of evidence and come up with a cohesive alternative scenario where there was an intruder in the house. So logically, if I had a 5-hour conversation with you, could I have probably persuaded you that she was not guilty? Could I break down each piece of evidence in this case? Absolutely. But the
I
circumstantial
can do that
evidence in
too.
any case can be broken down. You can find an excuse for anything. It's whether or not it is a logical, factual, and constructive alternative theory. Constructive being that each piece of evidence builds upon it. There is not an equally possible alternative theory in this case, because the evidence alone from the state's perspective proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Darlie killed her children. So the defense's job is to poke reasonable doubt, and there is simply not reasonable doubt. You can make doubt in any case. This case is simply not one where the doubt makes any sense. The most logical conclusion is that Darlie killed her kids.
Was there one piece of evidence, or was there one moment that changed your mind?
Yes. So hold on, bear with me because this is a long kind of tangent. I need to explain a little bit about the crime scene. So when the police responded, the bloody butcher knife was located on the counter where Darlie said she left it. That knife, and this is very important, only had Darlie's and Damon's blood on it. That was located. They swabbed it in 4 places. So it's possible Devin's blood was on it, but they weren't able to locate it. Not even a weak partial profile. They also noticed, Darlie said that the intruder had dropped the knife on the utility room floor, but there was no real evidence of that. But I don't tend to put much weight in that because blood spatter like that, in terms of whether or not blood would spatter in the shape of the knife, that's questionable. But they also noticed, indisputably, a knife impression near Devin's body in the living room. It was pressed into the carpet. It was a very clear outline of the murder weapon. That had Darlie's blood. That outline was composed entirely of Darlie's blood, okay? So Darlie says that she's going back and forth bringing towels to the boys. She says that she's going to the sink and wetting the towels, and that's her reason, because they noticed that there was a significant amount of blood in front of the sink and on the cabinets in front of the sink, but none on top of the cabinets in front of the sink and none in the sink. So the police luminol it and notice that the sink has been cleaned up. The luminol evidence, it lit up like a Christmas tree, according to them. The supporters will say that, well, of course it was washed away because she's getting towels and that water is spattering all over. Okay? And it's wiping the blood away. There is no evidence of footprints leading to the sink. There is only evidence of a significant amount of blood pooling in front of the sink and Darlie's footprints leading away from the sink. One set. What are the odds that she's able to run 5 or 6 times, according to court testimony, back and forth between the sink and leave only one set of footprints leading away? The supporters say, well, she could have only stepped in the blood once. But there is a constant trail of blood. Regardless of whether or not she's bleeding from her feet, the blood would be running down and the blood is going to cling to her skin and it's going to get on the bottom of her feet at some point. And she's running back and forth between this crime scene, trailing blood everywhere. Yet how come there's no evidence that she was ever leaving the sink? So then you look at the DNA analysis of the sink and they found blood mixing in it. They found Darlie's, Devin's, and Damon's blood mixed together on 2 swabs they took of the sink, meaning that all 3 victims' blood was deposited into the sink at some point. So logically, you can come up with the conclusion that at some point, Darlie's standing at the sink, and the blood is being dripped into the sink, and the boy's blood is mixing with it somehow. What's the only object that would have had the boy's blood on it in the house? The butcher's knife. So then you look at the DNA analysis of the butcher's knife. It's only Darlie and Damon's blood. The state theorized, because Damon was able to crawl 10 feet across the living room, that he was attacked twice. So the alternative scenario that the state presented was that, as opposed to an intruder, was that Darlie had stabbed the boys, washed the butcher's knife off in the sink, slashed her own throat, and the blood mixed. She wiped it away. And at that point, she's still holding the knife. She's actively bleeding onto the knife. She realizes that Damon is still alive. She hides the knife behind her back because there are 2 knife impressions on the back of her shirt and only her blood, and approaches him, goes over and checks to see if Devin is still alive too, hence the knife impression on the floor of the living room, goes back and attacks Damon again, and then sets the knife on the counter, hence the blood mixing on the knife.
So was it DNA report on that knife that changed her mind?
but it was also the fact that her footprints don't go back and forth to the sink.
Right.
The only logical reasoning behind all of that blood evidence. Because originally people were factoring in, well, if she's getting towels for the boys, then the blood could be spattering on her. But there's no evidence she ever got towels for the boys. Additionally, none of the blood in the house was diluted. There was no wet towels. There was no water ever dripped through the house. The only diluted blood was found in the sink. So that's also contradictory to her story of getting towels at the sink for the boys.
It just makes your blood run cold, you know?
It's absolutely horrifying.
Have we covered everything that we wanted to cover? Is there more?
One more thing that I don't believe we talked much about. So Darlie was adamant that the intruder had dropped the bloody knife on his way out of the house. So the state's expert Tom Bevel testified that there was no evidence that a bloody knife had been dropped on the utility room floor. And this is a piece of evidence I struggle with because a lot of non-supporters do use it as a point, but to the credit of Darlie's supporters. Blood spatter is a very inexact science, and whenever people get stabbed, especially through the clothes, which one of the boys was, a lot of people expect to see this really, really bloody knife, like there's going to be a solid red blade, but that's not usually the case. Usually you'll see very little, if any, real blood pooling on the blade of the knife. And there's not really a point of, oh, yes, we could determine for a fact that the bloody knife was or was not dropped on the utility room floor. But what is interesting about the blood pattern on the utility room floor is that there are so many perfect cylinder drops. And we know that blood dripped onto a surface into a perfect cylinder with no variation. It's an equal diameter at every point. We know that the person was standing either completely still or walking very slowly. And you see a significant amount of perfect cylinder droplets on the utility room floor. So it seems very interesting and very contradictory to her story that she was allegedly just running after the intruder, picked up the knife, turned around, and ran back to the living room. The blood drops do not support her version of events. She can't really come up with a reason for it. And it's just, again, the little things like that. In fact, that's what almost all of the blood drops in the kitchen looked like. They were almost all perfect cylinders, which means she was not running around as she claimed she was. It just creates a very, very clear picture. And oftentimes I'll see prosecutors reference a puzzle when talking about a criminal trial. And a lot of people seem to believe that you have to have a complete puzzle to convict somebody. But in actuality, if you have a 100-piece puzzle, you can have 90 pieces and still tell what that puzzle makes. If it's a picture of a fish and you have 90 out of 100 pieces, you can still tell that's a fish. You could probably even tell what type of fish. And if that's your definition of beyond a reasonable doubt, you are always going to have questions in a case. There's not going to be an explanation for every piece of evidence. Because even if a case is captured on video, it's not the same as the human perspective. We can't crawl inside Darlie Routier's mind. I don't know why she stabbed her nightshirt. We can only speculate. But what we do know is it's not consistent with her story. And there is only so much that we can excuse. They had an expert who said she had traumatic amnesia. Traumatic amnesia is a real thing. People get confused. People get scared. And people's brains block things out. But isn't it interesting that she didn't have that traumatic amnesia until she gave her voluntary statement? That she was telling people over and over again, I remember the attack. And isn't it interesting that not only did she have traumatic amnesia when she gave her voluntary statement and when she took the witness stand, but in between all of this, that traumatic amnesia gets erased, and she's able to tell her family in letters from jail and friends that she saw him. She knows it was Glenn Mize. She knows it was her neighbor. She knows it was XYZ. She saw him. She knows what happened. Isn't it interesting that she was able to tell the Rick Roberts show that she knows what happens in that house that night? That she knows everything that happened here until she gets on the witness stand 7 months later and can't tell us any sort of clear story except for what her version of events after the fact is.
I watched a lot of pro-Darlie documentaries, interviews, Lisa Gibbons, anything I could find to try to pull up the most common arguments. And one thing they really have going for them is the lack of a motive. What do you think the motive was in this crime?
The Routiers were very superficial. Darlie Routier was 26 years old and was the matriarch of her entire extended family. They were the most successful, arguably, at a young age. Darlie's sister was frequently staying with them. She was 16 and getting ready to get married, and Darlie was helping her with that. To me, that would be something I would ask my mother to do, but it's clear that that was not an appropriate relationship dynamic in this family. She has postpartum depression after the birth of Drake, and she's taking care of Darren, Devin, Damon, and Drake, all at the same time, in addition to supervising all these other things. She's buying her sister's wedding dress. She's, for some reason, 2.5 years in advance planning on renewing her vows with Darren. She has a lot of stress. Anybody knows, just living day-to-day life, that's stressful in itself. But piling on all of this to a narcissist who thrives upon a superficial appearance of wealth and overall giving the impression that she's better than other people. This type of buildup can be detrimental. It can completely destroy a life. And I think that she was able to compartmentalize enough to where she realized that the majority of her stress, that in itself was manufactured because it simply wasn't going her way all the time. Everything was falling apart with them. Their finances, the gate was broken. Like every small little thing was falling apart in addition to the big things. She was able to compartmentalize enough to where she determined that her children were the source of that anger and that stress. They were the reason that her life was going haywire. So she simply made a decision that she was going to eliminate the source of her stress and the source of her anger and all of that. That was the reason she killed her children. It was simply that she thought they were in her way. Not of money, not of the good life. I think that was a small part of it. But in her mind, that's what they were in the way of. They were in the way of her being successful.
And narcissistic mothers, I mean, I think people don't really have a good idea, or if you don't have an experience, if you've never met one, when their children are not how they pictured it, the experience of being a mother isn't how they pictured it, they get very angry.
Yeah. One thing that is so interesting, which this kind of goes back into the motive of the crime, but also just like a little interesting tidbit of information. The children had splashed half the water out of the hot tub that night. And that so upset Darlie that she told Devin that he wasn't allowed to have a friend to sleep over. That a friend was supposed to sleep over that night, but she canceled. And I think that that kind of goes both ways in determining, that might have been her breaking point. Something as simple as splashing the water out of the hot tub, that could have been the point where she decided, I'm done. And that her most logical reason was to kill the children. And I also think it shows setting up the opportunity of no, your friend can't spend the night. And I think that that goes to show that she was probably planning on it, at least from the evening of the incident.
That's really interesting. And also, what she says about her children, they would be having the biggest party, that they wouldn't want us to be sad. They're so happy up in heaven. To me, when I hear that, I hear her thinking that I'm giving them eternal happiness in heaven, too. I'm relieving them from the stress of this terrible world. Do you see that?
I think that that's how Darlie imagined it coming out. Like, unintentionally, she was justifying that for herself.
Right, exactly.
I don't think that it was...
Oh, no, not a motivation. If you're suicidal and you see suicide and death as the ultimate happiness for yourself and your children, it does certainly take out a little bit of the morality out of it, right?
Oh, I agree. I don't believe that Darlie was actually suicidal. I think that she did it solely for attention. Not necessarily like that it was a calculated move. A lot of people will threaten suicide because it's a cry for help. And that's a better way of putting it. I believe that she did it because it was a cry for help. That she had realized that her life was getting to the point of it was so overwhelming for her. And I don't blame her for that. And then she had this cry for help, and Darren dismisses it as the baby blues. And I think that that was another trigger for her. That nothing had changed after that. And people, I'm so sorry to keep on talking, but people also love to throw out things like, oh, well, it's all circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence is literally anything apart from eyewitness testimony. People often don't understand that. DNA, forensics, that's all circumstantial evidence. Direct testimony means eyewitnesses. And quite frankly, eyewitnesses are not as reliable as forensics. Wrongful convictions, do they happen? Absolutely. But not as much as people would have you believe. And not everything is a conspiracy.
So what happens when you're 12 years old, you start on this journey looking into this case, and you devote all this time and energy, and I guess you have of one mindset, and all of a sudden...
everything comes crashing down?
Yeah, you realize a little bit of your identity has been kind of, I guess, you're wrong. You have to admit you're wrong. I mean, what is that experience like?
It was very hard. I was talking to, so I run the Rockwall True Crime Club, and the admins are so amazing. Like, some of them, I have a lot of friends my own age, but sometimes I need the advice of people who are a little bit more mature and may have gone through something like this. So I talked to my parents about it, and I was, devastated talking to them about it because they've supported me. I mean, they've they've funded over, $15,000 of my investigation into this case. So it was at first very, very upsetting. I went to the boy's grave because I hadn't visited in a while and I needed to clear my head a little while. And I left flowers for them and cleaned it up a little bit and then kind of left because I knew that would be a good opportunity to level myself because it is such an emotionally charged case. It's impossible not to get emotionally involved in certain cases. And when you are getting so close with the family and so close with people who are so passionate about this, you get so emotionally attached. Like you said, it becomes part of your identity. So that day was just awful for me personally. And then the next day I woke up and I just kind of said, I need to think about this logically. And the hardest part for me was not admitting I was wrong, but I felt like I was letting people down. I felt like I had inspired so many people to look into this case, and I felt like I had so many people advocate for her. And at the end of the day, I felt like people would think that I was tricking them into advocating for a baby killer. Because if they shared my change of heart, then that's how I felt. I felt like I was advocating for a baby killer, the worst kind of person ever. And that was difficult for me. It was hard.
I've talked to a few people who've had similar Adnan Syed supporter, Lynn Hartman, who was engaged to Stephen Avery. I'm very interested in the story because it really, I don't know why it took me so long to figure out, because this is my story too. You know what I mean? This is also my story. I used to believe all this stuff. I used to watch documentaries and believe all on a superficial level.
Yes. And that was such a hard thing for me to comprehend also, is that I didn't just fall for a documentary. I looked through countless records. I have a 250 gigabyte folder on my computer devoted to this case. All of that I had already seen. And it was like, oh my God, like how could I be so blind to stuff that was right in front of me? I wasn't tricked by someone else. I was tricked by myself, and I was tricked by Darlie.
Wow.
That was hard for me. Because I was like, I don't fall for Stephen Avery because I've seen the actual stuff. I'm not worried about making a murderer. In this case, I had seen the actual stuff and I still fell for her. I fell for her manipulation. And this is not going to be the right way of saying it, and I hope that you don't take this out of context, but whenever you start to support Darlie, you fall in love with the idea of Darlie. She is a victim. She is everything that is wrong with the justice system, And you don't fall in love with the person of Darlie, as some people do. I never really viewed her as anything other than the center of my case, but I always considered the boys to be a more realistic motive to fight for truth for them. And you fall in love with the idea of Darlie being innocent. That's a better way of putting it. You fall in love with the idea of Darlie being innocent, and love is blind. And you want to believe her, and you want to accept everything that her supporters say as fact, because it's easy to buy into. They're charismatic. She's charismatic. That's how she succeeded in convincing so many people.
If this weren't a death penalty case,
yes,
would this still be such a famous case?
No, it would not be.
Is that part of the appeal, that she's on death row, that she's going to be sent to death for a crime that she didn't commit?
Yes, I think that is part of the appeal. And I think for some people, it's so against what people are taught to believe in our, forgive me for going pretty liberal, but patriarchal society, that it's very contradictory to the idea that women are simply not going to do something like this. And that if they did it, they don't deserve to die. That doesn't sit right with a lot of people. A lot of her supporters simply don't want to believe that a mother would kill their children. And I think that it's just not the case. I mean, there are so many women commit capital murder, not at an equal rate to men, but at a proportionate rate. And I think that the idea of a woman being on death row for a crime she didn't commit is just very exciting to people. One real quick tidbit, I'm so sorry, that I would love to point out. On Darlie's initial appeal, she never challenged the sufficiency of the evidence. She solely challenged procedural errors, and I think that is very, very revealing. If I were truly innocent, I would make my attorney put in that the evidence is insufficient to support a verdict of guilty. That's what it's called whenever you're challenging the sufficiency or your actual guilt of the crime.
Mm-hmm.
But she never challenged that.
What were things that she challenged? She challenged I heard about the court transcripts were
Yes.
terrible. What were some of the other, what were her arguments?
She challenged several, overrulings of the trial court. Like when they objected to the silly string tape, I believe. She argued that her attorney had a conflict of interest when he represented Darren during a gag order hearing for 15 minutes.
Oh, I remember that. Yes, I remember that. Mm-hmm. I'd forgotten about that.
But yeah, literally the entire thing apart from the conflict of interest was surrounding the reporter's record, except for the last few points of error were regarding jury selection and that the court reporter had allegedly sent back an incorrect interpretation of Darren Routier's testimony, but I was reviewing that and that's not true. And then the trial court erred in refusing to rule on appellant's formal bill of exception, and that's just a procedural error. So the entire thing was procedural based. None of it was actual innocence based.
Basically, she wanted to get off on a technicality. They
Yes.
thought the evidence, that shows how strong the evidence was.
Let me think. So she challenged the court record because she didn't agree to the reconstructed record. What ended up happening was the stenographer made a number of errors, which, according to testimony, yes, several of them were significant, but most of them were just errors that could have been corrected with a read through, like rephrasing of testimony and stuff. But you have to remember, that doesn't impact what the jury heard.
Right.
It doesn't change the facts of the case.
I think that's right. The one thing I wanted to say is that my experience with talking to people who leave groups like this, who leave supporter groups and are public about the convicted person's guilt, that they are gone after.
Oh, yes.
I think someone who's been a supporter who's changed their mind is very, makes a very compelling argument for the person's guilt.
Yes. I was kind of expecting to be gone after. I will say I did not expect such rampant homophobia. That's been a lot of the attacks. And that's been hard. But yes, it's not been fun.
So they've just gone after your character.
They're just going to try to make me out to be a bad person when I have no real impact on this case. I remember I did a live video explaining it and people were mocking me because I said I'm the most famous supporter, which it was taken out of context. It was more like I'm giving my reasons because I know people care about my opinion. You know, people like you actively request me for interviews, and this is something that is close to my heart, and I feel like I need to explain myself. But I have no real impact on this case. My opinion does not matter in the grand scheme of things. Whether or not Darlie Routier is ever released, which she should not be, but if she ever is, my opinion doesn't matter about it. You know, the only reason that I have any sort of notoriety surrounding this case is because people are interested in what I have to say about it. I'm a consultant at best, you know? I'm not part of her appellate team. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not anybody who has any sort of real, tangible impact on this case.
So you're studying, you want to be a lawyer? Is that right?
Yes. I'm a women's and gender studies major at University of Texas, and I'm pre-law.
And what kind of law do you think you'd want to practice?
I wanted to be a criminal defense attorney, but now I really want to be an appellate lawyer. Because I read court transcripts like a book, and I try to get all these records, obviously, and I realized that it's way more interesting to review the record after the fact than try to go through hundreds of thousands of pages of discovery and try to prepare a defense that's not going to go to trial. I'm pretty good at it in terms of going through the records.
Okay, I have one more question. I'm so sorry, Ryan, because you're the first person who was a supporter I've interviewed or talked to that truly looked at all the evidence, read the court records, you know.
Anybody who's still a supporter and has gone over them thoroughly with an unbiased point of view is fooling themselves or is lying because they want to manipulate people. Whether that's malicious or if it's just kind of a social experiment unintentionally and see what all they can come up with. You'll see that a lot in the supporter groups. People that will just fight and fight and fight for the purpose of fighting for her and ignore crucial evidence that doesn't go to their cause or just try to find a way to excuse it.
So your advice is to read the court records, look at the evidence in an unemotional way.
Yes.
That is your advice to someone before becoming a supporter of anyone or a non-supporter, would you say?
I agree with both. I definitely think that if you are reviewing a record after the fact and you are trying to come up with a particular solution, that it will be tainted. I don't think that starting off with an innocent perspective or a guilty perspective is necessarily harmful. I would recommend going in and as unbiased as possible and always giving the presumption of innocence. Because that's what a jury has to do. And I always try to try a case in my mind from a jury's perspective. And in terms of Darlie, read the trial transcripts. There's a lot. But if you really don't want to, then read the defendants and the state's appellate briefs. Not the habeas petition, the appellate briefs. Because the habeas petition is filled with so much misinformation on her side, but the state's appellate brief really, really underscores some of the evidence against her.
You've made some terrific arguments here, and I've just really enjoyed talking to you. Is there anything we missed?
Oh, there was one thing I wanted to say earlier, but it had slipped my mind. One of the dangers of this case is that Darlie doesn't need a documentary. She doesn't need a film crew. She doesn't need anybody but herself to fool you. And that's a very dangerous thing. I used to think that it was a good thing to have emotion when looking at a case. And when you're factoring in the victim, it absolutely is. But whenever you are looking at a case where somebody's already been convicted, you have to take what the defendant says with a grain of salt. It is a tough thing to do because if they're proclaiming their innocence, you want to believe them. But she is a dangerous person. She's a scary person. She can fool you and she can manipulate you and she can convince you that what she says is the God's truth. She and her supporters want to portray her as very naive, but she is not. That was illustrated at trial. That's illustrated in every lie she's ever told. She is a convincing person. She is a narcissist, and she is dangerous.
It's a great quote to leave it on. Ryan, thank you so much for this interview. It's really been fascinating talking to you, and I obviously relate so much to your to your story. And let's stay in touch, and maybe we can talk some more some other time because this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Now, there you have it from someone who is very smart. Anybody that ever knew Darlie, blah, blah, blah. But he shares some of the same views as I do. And the supporters went after him for for being a homosexual. They were homophobic, just like he said. The supporters and the family went after him after he left support. So it was the same thing they did with me. They're still coming after me to this day, and then they say that I'm the one that came after them. But I suggest that you listen to this. Darlie Routier is dangerous.